The circulatory system. In this lesson, we're talking about blood circulation, including pulmonary circulation and systemic circulation, blood vessels, red versus blue blood, arteries, veins, and capillaries, the blood and blood cells, the heart rate, medical conditions, and then prevention of those conditions. Now, the circulatory system is going to consist of three main things: blood vessels, blood, and the heart. Overview. The heart pumps blood through the body through blood vessels. So these are going to be our arteries, capillaries, and veins. The arteries are going to be here in red. The capillaries are going to be the thing that transitions from the red to the blue, and the veins are going to be here in the blue. Arteries take blood away from the heart, veins return blood to the heart, and capillaries are the thing that are going to transfer the oxygen and food to the tissues. Now, blood is going to carry oxygen, so food, and glucose towards, and CO2 away from the tissues. So it's going to be very important. And the lungs, keep in mind, are not part of the circulatory system, although they do play a vital role in its function. Circulatory system, blood vessels. Two pathways. Now, when you're talking about the circulatory system, you're either going to go to the body, which is this pathway here, systemic circulation, or you're going to go to the lungs, which is what's called the pulmonary circulation. Pulmonary is going to refer to the lungs. So anything that's pulmonary is lung related. Systemic is going to be body. So the systemic circulation is going to be blood that's carried back and forth from the tissues to the heart, and the pulmonary circulation is going to be blood that's carried from the heart to the lungs. Now, there's three main types of vessels that blood travels through. Number one is arteries. Now, we're mostly going to show our arteries as red because what people mostly think of as oxygenated blood is red. However, as we'll see later on, oxygenated blood is red and so is deoxygenated blood. It's just a different shade of red. Veins we're going to show as blue, and capillaries we're going to show as red and blue because oxygen is lost to the tissues between here and here. Now, something to keep in mind is that arteries are not always going to be red. For instance, the pulmonary artery right here is blue because it's deoxygenated. So properly what we're going to be doing is writing anything that's blue is going to be deoxygenated blood, and anything that's red is going to be oxygenated blood, which is mostly going to associate with blue for veins and red for arteries. Now, red versus blue blood. So you got to keep in mind that blood is never blue. Oxygenated blood is bright red, and deoxygenated blood is dark red, and that's where we kind of get the bluish tint look to it. Now, veins appear blue because of the way light reflects off the blood vessels, and we don't really see arteries because they're just too deep inside the tissues. And we draw them blue simply to distinguish them on diagrams and to simplify things. Arteries versus veins. Now, there are pretty significant differences between structures. Artery walls are much thicker, are much more elastic, and have more muscle. So this is an example of an artery right here. And you can see that it's got lots of muscle. It's pretty strong. You can see here in the zoomed in version, we're going to have smooth muscle, we're going to have an elastic membrane, and it's going to be pretty strong. It's going to be able to go back to its original shape. Think of an elastic band. If you stretch an elastic band, it will go back to its original shape because it's elastic. Now, it's the same thing with arteries. They need to be able to expand when blood is pushed into them, and then contract back to their regular size in order to keep blood pressure up throughout the body. Now, veins, on the other hand, are thin-walled and contain valves to push the blood along. Now, all three of these pictures here, 1, 2, and 3, these are all arteries. So don't get this confused with a vein just because it's on the lower part of the screen. It's an artery, and you can tell because of all the muscle that it has, and you can't quite see the elastic tendencies to it, but it does have those as well. So why are arteries and veins the way they are? Well, blood is under very high pressure when it leaves the heart and enters the arteries. Remember, arteries take blood away from the heart. Therefore, to accommodate this added pressure, arteries need to be very strong, otherwise they'd burst. Once it's left the tissues and enters a vein, the blood is under very low pressure. Therefore, veins don't need to be strong, and therefore they are weak. Now let's zoom in on each one. So arteries carry blood away from the heart. That's how you know they're arteries. It's not necessarily because they have oxygenated blood, because they don't always have that. That's when they carry blood away from the heart. Now they're thick-walled, muscular, and elastic, like we've already talked about. They carry oxygenated blood except the pulmonary artery. That's the artery that goes from the heart to the lungs. Now, blood is carried under a great pressure, and we can notice this from our steady pulsating. So you can measure your pulse by putting your fingers on your wrist or your neck, like we're shown in this picture here, and you can feel the blood passing through the arteries. Every time it pulses, is your heart beating one time. Now, arteries branch into smaller arterioles as they enter the tissue. So if you think of an artery coming in like this, pretty thick, when it gets to the tissues, it's going to branch off, kind of like how a tree branches off, and then it'll branch even further, and so on, until it gets down to the tissue level. Now, veins are going to carry blood to the heart, and that's going to be our definition for our vein. So arteries carry blood away from the heart, veins carry blood to the heart. Now, they usually carry blood that contains waste and carbon dioxide, and the exception is the pulmonary vein. The pulmonary vein is going to take blood that's been oxygenated from the lungs to the heart, and then that blood is going to be pumped throughout the body. So the pulmonary vein is going to carry oxygenated blood from the lungs to the heart. Now, no matter what vein we're talking about, blood is going to be under low pressure. So how are we going to move our blood from one place to another if it's under low pressure? Well, we're going to have these valves, and that's shown here. So these valves show a one-way motion of blood. So blood can go up here, but as soon as it gets up here and wants to fall back down, well, it hits these valves, and it can't. So blood is going to sort of pool in this area here. And then we're going to get muscle contractions in the body. So actual body muscles, not not vessel muscles. And whenever that happens, it squeezes them and it pushes the blood up. So we're going to generate a little bit of pressure that way, but most of the blood's motion is going to be due to these valves where blood is able to go up, but it can't go back down. And just like we had arteries that branch off into smaller and smaller and smaller, our veins will also branch into smaller and smaller branches called venules. Capillaries are our smallest vessel, and you can see capillaries in things like eyes. When eyes are bloodshot, those are the capillaries showing up. Now they're microscopic walls, only about 1 cell thick, and they're located at the tissue level. Nutrients and gases, so oxygen and carbon dioxide, diffuse here from the vessel into the cells. So these are going to be very important. So blood is going to be pumped from the heart, and it's going to pass into smaller and smaller arterioles until it gets to closer to the tissue area. And at that point, it's going to branch off into many, many, many of these capillaries, and they're all about a cell thick. So we can stick all our cells sort of in between, if you will, here. And it's at this level that oxygen and carbon dioxide are going to diffuse back and forth between the body cells and the actual capillaries themselves. Now, this is kind of a cool picture. So this is a transmission electron microscope image of a red blood cell within the capillary. So you can see how small it actually is. This one red blood cell is going to take up more or less the entire width of the capillary. Aorta. So what's the largest blood vessel? Well, it's the blood vessel that leaves the heart and goes to the body. So it's going to be the one that supplies the systemic circulation, and it's going to be this guy right there. So it's going to come from the left side of the heart. It's going to come from the left ventricle. So blood is going to be pumped in from the lungs into the left atrium, into the left ventricle, and then out to the body via the aorta. Now the aorta is really, really thick. So just how thick is the aorta? Well, the aorta's diameter, so the width of the blood vessel itself. So if that was the head-on of the aorta, the diameter of the aorta would be 63, approximately, millimeters, which is about 2.5 inches. So it's really, really big. Blood vessels. So I like to equate blood flow to a trip to grandma's house. So stick with me here. So you're going to leave your home. That's your heart. You're going to jump on the highway. That's going to be the arteries, the big vessels that transport a lot of cars back and forth. You're going to get off at Grandma's Street. So those are the arterioles. You're going to pull into Grandma's driveway, which is like the capillaries. You're going to go inside her house, which is like the cell, and you're going to give your grandma a kiss. So that's going to be like giving her glucose and oxygen. You're going to leave with leftovers. That's like the carbon dioxide. Don't tell her, though, that you're equating this to the waste. Get back in your car, and you're going to exit her driveway, which is, again, the other side of the capillaries. You're going to drive along her street, the venules, back onto the highway going the other direction. Those are like the veins, and you're going to arrive back at your home, which is the heart. Circulatory system, blood. The blood. The human body contains 4 to 6 liters of blood. That's a lot of blood. And it's going to consist mostly of water, red blood cells, plasma, and then some white blood cells and platelets. And I really love this picture because it's a 3D image of the 3 main blood cells we're going to be talking about. We're going to have our red blood cells, our white blood cells, and these are going to be our platelets. So we're going to learn a lot more about those shortly. Your blood. Now the function of your blood is fluid transport. Now the liquid portion of your blood carries blood cells. So these things are going to be made in the bone marrow. And specifically we're going to be talking about erythrocytes, so red blood cells, leukocytes, white blood cells, and platelets. So these are going to be the fragments of cells in the bone marrow that's going to be involved in things like blood clotting. It's also going to carry proteins, and then as well as nutrients and gases, things from the digestive system and the respiratory system that's going to feed our cells and keep us alive. Oxygen in the blood. Hemoglobin is going to be our iron-containing molecule, and it's going to be found inside our red blood cells. So if this was a red blood cell, there'd be heme inside. Now, I'm not going to draw it everywhere, but we're just going to draw it here. So inside the red blood cell, there's going to be heme. Now this heme is going to catch oxygen that's floating around, especially in the lungs, and it's going to attach it to itself. So now it's going to be transporting the oxygen around. Now when it gets to the body tissues, it's going to release that oxygen back to areas where it needs it. So it's a pretty remarkable compound. When the oxygen is low, like in body tissues, it's going to release the oxygen. So we'll say when oxygen is high, like in the lungs, it's going to accept the oxygen and bind the oxygen to it. Now how this happens is relatively complex, but essentially the heme molecule is going to change shape when there's oxygen around so that it won't accept any more oxygen. When there's low oxygen, the shape is different again, different shape, different function, and it's going to be able to accept the oxygen at that point. Carbon dioxide. Hemoglobin also carries carbon dioxide. Now carbon dioxide also floats around in the blood, but it will also be picked up by hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide is a waste product of cellular respiration, so it's something that we produce as a result of going through our daily energy-producing functions. And it's going to travel to the lungs to be exhaled. Now, what does blood contain specifically? It's mostly water. 50% of our blood is water. 45% is red blood cells, or erythrocytes. 4% is plasma with substances. And 1% are going to be our white blood cells, or our leukocytes, plus our platelets. So let's be a little bit more specific about each one. So first up, erythrocytes, otherwise known as our red blood cells. They're going to be our main transporters of oxygen and carbon dioxide. They lack a nucleus, contain hemoglobin, and are disc-shaped. Now, like most blood cells, they're produced in the bone marrow, but they only live for about 120 days. At that point, our old red blood cells become less able to squeeze into tighter areas, and once they can't squeeze into those tighter areas, they're destroyed by the liver and spleen. It's a pretty efficient system. Pretty much as soon as they become incapable of doing their job, they're destroyed and replaced with new ones. Leukocytes, otherwise known as white blood cells. Now, white blood cells fight infection, so they're going to attack any foreign substance that comes into your body. They are much less abundant. They're also created in the bone marrow. Some live for a few months, while others only live for a couple days. And there are many types, and they do contain nuclei. So there's a main difference, right? Red blood cells, no nucleus. Now, pretty much the red blood cells get rid of that nucleus so they have more room for things like heme. But white blood cells need a brain. They need to be able to do stuff. So they are going to have a nucleus. And as you can see from this picture here, this is just an example of a few of the different types of white blood cells. We have monocyte, basophil, neutrophil, etc. So there's tons of different white blood cells, and they all are going to do different things. But in general, their main function is to fight infection. So when things come into your body, the white blood cells gear themselves up and kill that thing off. And our last main thing that we're going to talk about are platelets. Platelets are for clotting blood. They're cell fragments. They're produced in the bone marrow again, and they have a very short lifespan, about 1 week. And what they do is they form a nice web trapping blood cells from escaping. So if you get a cut, the platelets go to the area and form this web, preventing more blood from being lost so that the body can repair the damaged cells and eventually create the new skin. Circulatory system, the heart. Your heart. Your heart is going to be the thing that pumps blood around your body to keep you alive. It's a very large organ composed of cardiac muscle, and it's going to be rich in mitochondria. It's going to be rich in mitochondria because it needs to do a lot of work, therefore it needs a lot of energy. And if your heart stops, you die. Heart structures. So there are many main structures inside the heart. These are going to be the ones we're going to be covering. So let's start from the top, and we're going to go clockwise. So first up is the aorta. The aorta is the thing that's going to supply the body with oxygen-rich blood. So it's going to be our main artery, and it's going to be about 2.5 inches or about 63 millimeters in diameter. So it's going to be huge, and it's going to be under a lot of pressure. So it's going to be really muscular as well. It receives blood from the left ventricle and pumps it out to the rest of the body. The pulmonary arteries right here are going to be those arteries that bring oxygen-poor blood to the lungs. So it's going to be our only set of arteries that have oxygen-poor blood. Now, they're still arteries because they leave the heart. They push blood away from the heart somewhere else. The left atrium gets oxygen-rich blood from the lungs. So after the pulmonary arteries go to the lungs, the blood comes back oxygen-rich and goes into the left atrium. Pulmonary veins bring oxygen-rich blood from the lungs to the left atrium. The left ventricle sends our oxygen-rich blood to the body. That's going to send our blood out the aorta. The right ventricle is going to send oxygen-poor blood to the lungs. So when our blood comes in from the rest of our body, it's going to eventually make it to the right ventricle, which then goes to the lungs to be reoxygenated. The right atrium is going to receive oxygen-poor blood from the body. Specifically, it's going to receive it from the vena cavas. Now, there's a superior vena cava that comes in from the top part of the body, like that, and there's an inferior vena cava that comes from the bottom part of the body, kind of like that. And what they're going to do is they're both going to feed into this main vena cava, which is going to bring oxygen-poor blood into the heart, specifically into the right atrium, like I was just talking about. After it leaves the right atrium, it travels down into the right ventricle, and then it goes out to the lungs via the pulmonary artery. Heart structure. The human heart has 4 main chambers. There's going to be 2 upper atriums, so that's this guy here and here. They're going to have thinner walls. They're going to be a little bit less muscular. There's going to be less work for them to do, so they don't need to have quite as much muscle. And then you have 2 lower ventricles, here and here, which have much thicker walls. They're much more muscular because they have to do a lot more work. They're going to be the things that pump the blood out either to the aorta or through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. Now, the human heart also has 4 valves. We're going to have the tricuspid, which is here, the mitral, which is there, pulmonary, and aortic. Now, what they're going to do is they're going to keep blood flowing in a single direction. So if blood goes up this way, it can't fall back down because this valve is going to close. There's only one way that it can travel. Same with this valve right here. In this case, it's going to be the opposite way. Blood's going to come in from the left atrium. It's going to travel down to the left ventricle. And then when the left ventricle squeezes, blood is going to have to go up this way because it cannot travel back that way because this valve is going to close like this. So when this valve closes, blood can't get back up. So the only place that the blood can travel is through the aorta. And then we're going to have the same thing with the aortic valve right here. So the aortic valve is going to allow blood to travel up into the aorta. But as soon as it does, it can't travel back in. So as soon as it goes up, it's good to go, but it can't go back that way. Blood flow through the heart. So you can see from these 3 diagrams how our blood is going to flow. We're going to start up here when the blood comes into the atrium. So that's going to be number 1 and number 1. Blood then flows into the ventricles. So that's 2 and 2. And then flow and then blood flows up into either the aorta or the pulmonary arteries in 3 and 3. And then it's just going to repeat over and over and over again. So a little bit more detail. So first up, both atria are going to fill at the exact same time. The right atrium receives oxygen-poor blood from the body, from both the superior and inferior vena cava, so that's going to be the superior, and that's the inferior, and they're both going to feed into the right atrium right there. The left atrium receives oxygen-rich blood from the lungs through 4 pulmonary veins, so that's this guy, that guy, that guy, and that guy. And they're all going to dump oxygen-rich blood into the left atrium right there. After they fill, the atria contract, pushing blood into their respective ventricles. The right ventricle contracts and pushes oxygen-poor blood towards the lungs via the pulmonary artery, and we can see that right here. So when it contracts, the tricuspid valve, remember we just talked about that, it's going to close, so blood can't go back that way, and it's going to send blood that way and that way to the lungs. The left ventricle also contracts and forces oxygen-rich blood out of the heart through the aorta. So this aortic valve will close after the ventricle pushes blood out, so the blood can't come back in. And then from the aorta, it's either going to go up to things like the brain, the arms, stuff like that, or it's going to go down and feed the lower part of the body, things like the legs, the stomach, stuff like that. Now, what controls the heart? Well, the heart is controlled by nerves and hormones. The heart has its own set of nerves, which control the rhythm and will cause it to beat even if it's disconnected from the brain. These nerves can be substituted for by an artificial pacemaker if necessary. So if your heart's nerves aren't working properly or your heart's beating out of control, doctors can implant what's called an artificial pacemaker, which we can see right here, and that will control the beating of your heart. Now, the brain is connected to the heart and can speed it up during exercise or slow it down when you're doing things like sleep when needed. So we have a regular sinus rhythm of our heart, just our heart's regular rate. And then if we need to speed it up or slow it down, that's when our brain's going to step in and control it further. Certain hormones, such as epinephrine, otherwise known as adrenaline, impact how the heart operates. These hormones can be created by the body in times of need, i.e. if you're running away from a bear, or given as a treatment. For instance, epinephrine is given when someone's having an anaphylactic reaction. This epinephrine opens up the breathing tubes, gets the heart rate going faster, pretty much pushes the body to do as much as it can to keep itself alive. Your heart, the vital pump. So at rest, the heart beats approximately 60 to 80 times per minute. So that's about 4.7 liters every minute. During extreme exertion, so exercise, it can beat between 150 to 200 times per minute, which is about 38 liters of blood passing through your heart every minute. So why does it pump more? Well, during exercise, your brain sends signals to increase your heart rate. This happens very, very quickly. At the same time, your adrenal gland secretes epinephrine. This takes a little longer, but is longer acting. Both work together to increase blood flow around your body. So why do we need an increase in blood flow around the body? Well, an increase in blood flow leads to an increase in oxygen and glucose delivery, as well as CO2 removal, which allows the body to produce more energy for the exercise. Medical conditions. Coronary artery disease. Your heart needs oxygen too. It's supplied with oxygen by coronary arteries. That's these guys right here. They're going to be all the arteries that feed the heart. Coronary arteries can become partially blocked by plaque, mainly fat and cholesterol. And this is generally caused by lifestyle choices and genetics. This block limits the amount of oxygen delivered to the heart. It can cause tiredness, dizziness, and pain. And you can see from this picture right here what fatty deposits in this plaque looks like. It narrows the diameter of the arteries. Now, if the arteries in the heart are narrowed, there's less blood flow that can get to the heart to feed it, to allow it to pump. Now, coronary artery disease can be diagnosed with an angiogram, whereby a fluorescent dye is injected into the bloodstream, and you can see it here. Now, this is an angiogram of a brain, but you can see the same idea. The fluorescent dye goes in, and you can see as it moves around the arteries inside that area. If an area is blocked, you can see where the dye doesn't actually get to. Now, this dye shows up on an X-ray and shows where blood flow is disrupted. Now, again, a little bit more of a zoomed-in picture of the same thing we were talking about. So we're going to get our deposits inside an artery, which leads to a narrowing of that particular artery. If the artery is narrowed too much, we're going to lead to things like heart attack. Now, heart attack is when the coronary arteries become completely blocked. No oxygen can reach the heart muscle, and eventually the heart muscle begins to die and stop beating. Symptoms of this include things like nausea, shortness of breath, severe chest pain, sweating, dizziness, fatigue. If you're experiencing any of these things, immediate medical attention is needed. Medical conditions. Stroke. Now, stroke is kind of like a heart attack for the brain, in that the blood cannot reach the brain due to a blockage or severe brain bleed. Brain cells die due to lack of oxygen, just like heart muscle dies due to lack of oxygen, and it can lead to things like paralysis, loss of ability to speak, and death. And you can see from this picture here, this is of a brain bleed, and you can see how if the blood vessel inside the brain ruptures, the blood will spread everywhere inside the brain, and it won't actually get to the cells that it needs to get to. Now, the main signs of a stroke include sudden numbness or weakness in the arms, legs, or face, sudden trouble speaking, confusion or difficulty understanding speech, sudden trouble seeing in one or both eyes, sudden trouble walking, loss of balance, dizziness or lack of coordination, and a sudden severe headache with no known cause. So if you think someone is having a stroke, act fast and do the following simple test. F for face. Ask the person to smile. Does one side of the face droop? A for arms. Ask the person to raise both arms. Does one arm drift downwards? S for speech. Ask the person to repeat a simple phrase. Is the speech slurred or strange? T for time. If you see any of these signs, you need to call 911 right away. Prevention. The best means of prevention include things like regular exercise, weight control, a well-balanced diet, not smoking, and a diet low in saturated fats. All these things will lower the amount of stuff that gets stuck in those arteries, preventing things like strokes, heart attacks from happening in the first place. And that concludes our lesson on the circulatory system.